Hello, and welcome back to United for Peace, Episode 2.4, Mission Accomplished. Welcome back. Before we begin, I have some podcasty things to go over for once. First things first. We have 2 episodes left in this series. One will cover the collapse of the mission once Egypt withdraws consent for UN personnel to remain on its territory all the way out in 1967. Since we're barely into 1957 right now, one may guess that there's a lot more to go over. But no, there really isn't much more until the mission collapses. I could go over every individual commander rotation, and when each nation pulled out so many dozens or hundreds of troops, but there really isn't anything interesting between 1957 and 1967. So, there will be an episode on the end of the mission, and a retrospective, much like the one at the end of our series on the operation in the Congo. Secondly, after this series wraps up, there will be at least one supplemental episode covering just how the UN works, what its principal organs are, what they do, why, and so on, before moving on to the next armed peacekeeping mission. I also want to produce one on the origins of the United Nations, but since that is deeply entwined in, like, World War II, that could take too long to make in a timely fashion, and may come later. Finally, I have neglected to say on air that we have a website, UFPpodcast.com. It has sources for the information I'm presenting to you, all episodes, a contact page, and very soon will include maps for what I've been discussing. So go check it out if you want a visual component for this show, to see what sort of research materials go into this, or if I've made a terrible mistake you'd like to point out to me. Now, on with the show. When we left off, the British and French had finally withdrawn from Egypt, but Israel kept resisting. Now, the UNEF will be spending this episode hardballing the Israelis to withdraw and temporarily taking over administration of the land Israel evacuates. But I want to elaborate what the force looks like as it's doing this. Time for the composition of the force. I just think you ought to know what goes into operations like this. Yugoslavia provided a full recon battalion right off the bat. Canada would eventually provide a fully equipped light armored squadron for recon, but it's not in Egypt yet in the time frame we're discussing today. And, just for the record, a squadron in this sense is functionally a battalion. But, while the armored squadron was a later addition, Canada provided a lot to the mission. They covered the ordnance depot and workshop, the central post office, engineering, the dental unit, movement control, and air support. They also covered medical care along with Norway, and units for transport, the Provost Marshal, and signals along with India. India was also in charge of the Supply Depot and Service Institute. I couldn't find more details about what the quote-unquote Service Institute was. I guess it either dealt with servicing vehicles and other types of maintenance, or it provided things like counseling and financial service for mission personnel. If anyone knows, I would love to hear from you. Moving on, the force was ultimately answerable to the Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld, who was sort of a commander-in-chief at this time. An informal military council he set up at UNHQ, headed by his military advisor, Major General Martola of Finland, assisted him in directing the force. But the force commander, who was basically the chief operating officer of the mission, actually, commanding the personnel and assets in the force, was Major General E.L.M. Burns from Canada. I've mentioned him before, and have not been in the habit of giving out biographical information about significant individuals here, but I think that has honestly been an oversight on my part. So let me tell you just a little bit about General Burns. First, he served in both World Wars. I don't understand how anyone could possibly go through World War I and voluntarily stay in the army, but to each their own. This is especially interesting in Burns' case, as he was wounded twice in World War I, during which he served as an engineer in the Canadian Army, and saw action in some incredibly famous engagements, most notably Vimy Ridge. Between the World Wars, he attended a few war academies, instructed some courses himself, and momentarily was deployed in Nova Scotia as part of Canada's response to the Nova Scotia coal strikes of 1922 through 1925. We don't have time to go into that, but if you like labor relations history and haven't heard of it, go look it up. It's fascinating. But just so you know, the Canadian Army didn't, massacre a bunch of coal workers. They were basically sent in to make sure the miners and the coal company police didn't slaughter each other. Moving on, at the rank of lieutenant colonel, he started attending the Imperial Defence College in London in 1939, just in time for World War II to break out. His experience in World War II was a whirlwind of changing command positions, and most of his combat command experience was in Italy. Despite the general success of the Canadian forces in Italy, his command of a corps, granted by a temporary promotion, was highly controversial, and so he was settled back into his permanent rank of Major General. He commanded some forces in northwestern Europe as well, from December 1944 to September 1945, being present for the end of the conflict in Germany. After the war, he served as Deputy Minister of Veterans Affairs in Canada and became a staunch advocate of multilateralism generally and the United Nations in particular. I guess seeing the world erupt in a mass self-destruction twice over nationalistic BS will do that to a person. For his outspoken positions on avoiding conflict and peacefully settling disputes between states, as well as his command experience, he was designated Chief of Staff of the UN Truce Supervision Organization, UNTSO, responsible for maintaining the General Armistice Agreements until a formal peace plan could be agreed upon by Israel and the Arab states. Then, the Second Arab-Israeli War broke out in the wake of the Suez Crisis. As the UN's most knowledgeable and experienced official in the region, he was tapped to command the new and unprecedented United Nations Emergency Force. He published a book in 1963 about his work in the Middle East. Unfortunately, I was unaware of this until I was already writing this episode, so I can't give you any review of it. Although I can tell you, I will most certainly read it at some point. It's called Between Arab and Israeli. So there you have a brief overview of Burns' professional life up to, including, and clearing the Suez War. Now, the numbers of personnel involved in the UNEF range from small division to pretty average brigade, just to give you an idea of the level of organization we're talking about. That's the kind of force he commanded, pretty suitable for a major general. In the hierarchy of this force, every nation's contingent did report to their own commander from their respective national armed forces, but those national contingent commanders did report to the force commander over the course of the mission. So that would mean Burns for the first 3 years, then the sequence of others we're not going to talk about because there's really no reason unless you want to simply memorize a list for the sake of knowing the whole list. And so, each national contingent owed their allegiance to their respective nations, even wearing their own uniforms, but they wore the United Nations insignia to mark their service to the UN. They also wore at this time the now iconic blue berets and helmets of the United Nations peacekeepers, which Hammarskjöld himself thought up during the formation of the force. I tell ya, Hammarskjöld did a lot in his time as Secretary General. Moving along, let's finally get back into the back and forth between the UN and Israel. The General Assembly passed Resolution 1002, noting Israel's lack of movement on previous calls to withdraw behind armistice lines, and calling upon the state once more to do so. In response, Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion made a statement to the Israeli parliament. In this statement, he said the 1949 armistice lines had no validity. He stated further, quote, "On no account will Israel agree to the stationing of a foreign force, no matter how called, in her territory or in any of the areas occupied by her." End quote. Secretary General Hammarskjöld wrote to Israel's foreign minister upon hearing this statement, noting how much this position would complicate fulfillment of the General Assembly's resolutions. This was all back on November 7th. The Secretary General would continue sending queries to Israel regarding what it would consider acceptable conditions for withdrawal and for stationing UNEF units along the Israeli-Egyptian front. On November 21st, the Israeli government finally provided a response. Israel wanted assurance that the threat and danger of belligerency would end. It noted that it had never sufficiently discussed with the UN the planned size, location, and stationing arrangement for UNEF units, as well as the proposed methods for executing their functions, and requested such information. Here, we see the pressure of a body representing the global community collectively forming some cracks in Israel's hardline position, even if there was nothing it could physically do about Israel's refusal to withdraw from Egypt. Well, you see, it's not that we're totally opposed to withdrawing and leaving the peace to you, it's just that we never fully discussed what all your mission entails. Yeah. Finally, reasonably, Israel expected clear policy statements from Egypt regarding its position on belligerency or peace towards Israel. Understandably, Israel's position regarding any matters affecting national security had to be heavily influenced by Egypt's policy position. On November 24th, with Israeli forces still on Egyptian soil, the General Assembly passed Resolution 1120, calling upon Israel to comply with the previous resolutions forthwith. That same day, Israel's representative notified the UN that the state had withdrawn the equivalent of 2 infantry brigades from Egypt. Clearly, the international pressure was building and building. Then, on December 1st, Israel's representative to the UN informed Hammarskjöld that Israel was withdrawing all forces from a band of approximately 50 kilometers along the entire front in Sinai. UNEF immediately moved to take up duties in the evacuated territory, but many roads were already destroyed, and Israel left behind minefields, so the advance was kinda slow. Then, Israel announced another troop withdrawal on December 11th to permit UNEF to continue expanding its area of operation. Major General Burns, force commander, met with General Moshe Dayan, commander of Israel's forces in Egypt, on December 16th. They agreed to specific terms for a first phase of withdrawal for Israeli troops. Then, UNEF troops advanced to within 5 kilometers of Israeli units. However, regarding the next phase of withdrawal, there was a bit of a snag. General Dayan told Burns that, according to his instructions, Israeli troops were to withdraw at a rate of approximately 25 kilometers per week over the next 4 weeks. Burns told him that simply wasn't good enough. At his request, the Israeli government submitted a new withdrawal plan that called for all Israeli forces to pull back behind the 1949 armistice line during the second phase, but did not specify the intended date for this. Not to get too bogged down in the details of exactly how Israeli forces withdrew, let's just say that Israeli forces had pulled back a great distance by January 16, 1957, with UNEF forces following them closely and taking up positions in El Arish and St. Catherine's Monastery. Notably, however, Israeli forces did not pull out of the area of Sharm el-Sheikh, despite all areas around it being evacuated. This is because Israel wanted to stay put there in order to secure freedom of navigation in the Gulf of Aqaba and the Persian Gulf. You see, Sharm el-Sheikh is on the western coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, in which Egypt had regularly intercepted and turned away maritime traffic to and from Israel. The Israeli government told Hammarskjöld on January 14th that it intended to withdraw entirely from the Sinai Desert by January 22nd, with the exception of Sharm el-Sheikh for this very reason. Hammarskjöld agreed that Israel had a right to pass through the Gulf of Aqaba and the Persian Gulf freely in accordance with international law, given the international significance of the bodies of water. Nonetheless, Israel had been called upon to withdraw from all Egyptian territory, and Hammarskjöld reported this explicitly noted violation to the General Assembly. And so, on January 19th, a now all too familiar cycle continued. The General Assembly passed Resolution 1123 requesting the Secretary General to continue pursuing a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces and report back within 5 days. International rules violated, Assembly calling upon the Secretary General to pursue a correction, and a report back to the Assembly eager to pass yet another resolution. It may seem tedious and maybe even pointless, but it's definitely not pointless in fact. When well-documented cases of global consensus being against a country pile up, it justifies independent and collective action from other states to re-establish norms or create new, better-suited ones for the changing global circumstances. And that is what the UN is really all about. Basically, General Assembly resolutions calling out a state are like write-ups. They don't mean anything on their own, but as they keep building up, they almost certainly bring about consequences of some sort. And if the Security Council passes a resolution against a state, well, it's like the police coming after you at that point. I digress. Back to UNEF. Hammarskjöld met with Israeli representatives on January 20th and 23rd. On the latter, Israel's representative delivered an aide-memoire laying out the Israeli position on Sharm el-Sheikh and Gaza. With regards to Sharm el-Sheikh, Israel argued that Security Council Resolution 95, passed in 1951, took legal and chronological priority over the General Assembly's resolutions of 1956. As a refresher, that was the one calling on Egypt to respect freedom of navigation through the Gulf of Aqaba and the Suez. Security Council resolutions are legally binding after all, and it was passed 5 years prior. Never mind the fact that unauthorized invasions of other sovereign states directly violated the UN Charter. Israel formally requested for Hammarskjöld to ascertain Egypt's intentions with regard to maritime traffic involving Israel in this area, since it considered freedom of navigation here to be of utmost importance. A little up north, with regards to Gaza, Israel questioned the legality of Egypt's occupation of this Palestinian territory from 1948 to 1956. Israel agreed to withdraw forces from Gaza, but said it planned to leave behind an Israeli civil administration to maintain security and run civil affairs. Israel also disagreed with the prospect of UNEF entrance into Gaza, while saying it would cooperate with the UN on providing assistance to refugees in the area. The following day, Secretary General Hammarskjöld formally articulated his own position. Naturally, his stance was that the UN couldn't accept Israel using military action to solve the problems it was concerned with, and it would have to work those problems out with Egypt off the battlefield. In particular, Hammarskjöld noted that it could not accept a civil Israeli administration in Gaza, since that would be a de facto change from the 1949 armistice agreement, which UNEF was now tasked with restoring. Such a change could be accepted with the consent of Egypt, that is. But that was not going to happen. On February 2nd, in response to Hammarskjöld's report, well, you know what happened. That's right, the General Assembly passed 2 more resolutions, 1124 and 1125, calling for all the things you're used to at this point. For Israel to withdraw troops, for everyone to uphold the armistice agreement, but also that the UNEF would be stationed on the armistice demarcation line to prevent any new flare-ups in the conflict. But the fact there were 2 resolutions caught you off guard a bit, eh? Anyway, communications were exchanged between Hammarskjöld and an Israeli representative, and meetings were held, but they were all inconclusive, since both sides wanted clarification for their own questions before clarifying the others. Global pressure carried the day. Israel's foreign minister announced to the General Assembly on March 1, 1957, that the Israeli government had agreed to withdraw all personnel behind the 1949 armistice line. On Hammarskjöld's instructions, E.L.M. Burns urgently met with General Dayan, again Israel's overall commander, to discuss technical aspects of the withdrawal and UNEF advance. It was agreed that Israel would withdraw from Gaza and UNEF forces enter the Strip during curfew hours the night of March 6th and 7th. UNEF entered without incident at this agreed upon time, and all but a small Israeli unit had withdrawn by then. It's okay though, because it was agreed that this unit too would withdraw on March 8th at 1600 GMT, the same time Israel would pull out of Sharm el-Sheikh. I am pleased to say the Secretary General was able to report to the General Assembly full compliance with Resolution 1124 that same day, as I'm sure on February 11th, 1957, Secretary General Hammarskjöld reported to the General Assembly that Egypt promised full observance of the 1949 Armistice Agreement on the assumption that Israel would also observe it. Egypt noted in particular it would like to see raids across the border in both directions stopped, and fully expected the General Assembly's subsidiary organs, i.e. the UNEF and Truce Supervision Organization, to support efforts to put a stop to these. Israel's official position was, however, as expressed in a letter dated January 25th, that the armistice agreement was broken beyond repair. The letter took aim at Egypt in scathing terms, saying, quote, Israel does not claim that the absence of an armistice agreement means the existence of a state of war with Egypt, even though Egypt insisted on the existence of a state of war even when the agreement was in existence. It went on to say that Israel was fully prepared to confirm the non-existence of a state of war by immediately signing a non-belligerency and mutual non-aggression agreement with Egypt. But the Secretary General still did not accept this position. In Hammarskjöld's opinion, since the 1949 Armistice Agreement contained no provision for unilateral termination, the armistice enforcement mechanisms would be held in place by the UNTSO. Basically, Israel was held to the standards of the Armistice Agreement against its will, since the agreement didn't have a provision for one side pulling out on its own. Kind of like how a country won't respect any one person deciding the law no longer applies to them, since it doesn't suit them, as the law contains no provision for someone deciding it no longer applies. Egypt agreed to UNEF's deployment along its side of the armistice demarcation line, but when Hammarskjöld once again asked Israel for consent for deployment along its side, no response was ever received. And so, on February 6th, Hammarskjöld wrote to the Israeli government stating he assumed the response was essentially negative, and so UNEF would not deploy on its side of the line. Just over a month later, by March 8th, UNEF was fully deployed along the west side of the line. This included along the Gaza Strip, the Sinai frontier, and the Sharm el-Sheikh area, which Israel started withdrawing from that same day. Once the force was established along the whole international frontier, they had a total of 273 kilometers, or 169 miles, to patrol. 59 kilometers for the entire border between Egypt and Israel-Palestine, and 187 kilometers between the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba and its exit point to the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Tiran. Then, 27 remaining kilometers for the boundaries of the Gaza Strip. The international frontier, meanwhile, had a system I will now lay out. 72 observation posts that were intervisible, that is, each being able to see the next one on either side of it, dotted the land frontier, manned during the daytime, with sentries replaced by 5 to 7 soldier patrols at nighttime. These patrols would cover a length of the frontier, typically 3 times a night by foot, paying particularly close attention to roads that may be used for infiltration. To the rear of each post, platoon camps were set up, which always had reserve detachments on hand in the event a post or patrol needed assistance. Telephone communication by day and flare signals and wireless communication by night made sure personnel on the frontier could always communicate quickly with the rear in case of an emergency. Along with these, 8 outposts were established with motor patrols running between them. They checked out particularly sensitive areas in cooperation with air patrols, once again relying heavily on the DHC-3 Otters, courtesy of Canada. It wasn't all patrols and aircraft that kept the border secure, however. UNEF also secured the cooperation of Egyptian and Palestinian authorities in preventing infiltration across the frontier. The force announced to the Gaza Strip, truthfully, that Egypt, as a matter of policy, was opposed to any infiltration across the border in either direction. They also notified them that approaching the armistice demarcation line within 100 meters by day and 500 meters by night was forbidden. Again, all with the blessing of Egyptian and/or Gaza authorities. And, the UNEF was authorized to apprehend anyone found to have crossed the demarcation line illegally, or who approached the line, quote-unquote, suspiciously. In practice, anyone within about 500 meters of the line could be apprehended if UNEF personnel deemed them suspicious. That doesn't mean anyone within 500 meters was apprehended, just that they could if they were suspicious. After interrogation, though, the force would hand individuals over to local police, who would keep them detained if suspicions were merited, or simply release them if not. While UNEF worked closely with all parties, Egyptian, Palestinian, and Israeli alike, they worked most closely with the Egyptian government, being the host state of the force and all. They enjoyed complete freedom of movement between their Sinai posts, UNEF headquarters, and the observation posts on the demarcation line, as well as freedom of flight over the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. They even got to man the Gaza airport. Just for a little context, the Gaza Strip was a Palestinian territory but had come under the effective administration jurisdiction of Egypt following, I don't have time to explain this thoroughly, so let's just say some shenanigans in 1948. So, part of the UNEF mission to restore the political status quo antebellum included restoring effective Egyptian administration. Except, of course, we are talking about effective jurisdiction because it was still technically a Palestinian territory. That is why I speak of Gaza police and Palestinian authorities. All this to say, the Gaza Strip was not technically Egyptian, but UNEF's close cooperation with Egypt is what secured for them permission to man the Gaza airport. With that, we are almost done with the technical and operational aspects of UNEF's deployment. But there's just a little more to go. Namely, what happened now that its duties overlapped so heavily with the older UN organ, the Truce Supervision Organization, of which the UNEF Force Commander was the Chief of Staff. As a matter of practicality, without altering the legal status of UNTSO, Secretary General Hammarskjöld placed all UNTSO representatives to the Egypt-Israeli Mixed Armistice Commission under the control of the UNEF Force Commander. Since Israel no longer recognized the armistice agreement as a matter of policy, it only lodged complaints regarding violations of the ceasefire and state of peace with UNEF. UNEF, on the other hand, considering the UN's position on the continuing legal status of the agreement, made it clear to Israel that all official investigations ought to be carried out by the Mixed Armistice Commission. But then, as a matter of practicality, problems arising between the UN and Israel regarding matters covered by the Armistice Agreement were handled by UNEF directly, which took over some duties formerly carried out by UNTSO. And I'll say it again, all of that is to say, UNEF effectively became the face of the UN for matters regarding Israeli-Egyptian relations and the maintenance of peace between them indefinitely. And there you have it. For the next 10 years, practically nothing will change about this whole situation. There will be occasional infiltrations across the armistice line by one illicit party or another, but Egypt and Israel themselves will remain basically at peace. Thank you for listening. I hope you will join me next time on United for Peace, as we discuss the collapse of the mission when the Arab states and Israel decided to enter the ring for yet another round of war.